And we have first Raúl Madrid speaking on some of the inferences, conclusions, thoughts, insights that emerge from the conference, and then we will have Steve Levitsky commenting on them, and then we want to open up again to the audience, also to the audience that has been following us on the web. Hundreds of people on the web have been live streaming here, so we want to give them an opportunity too to ask the questions that they have submitted. Raúl.
So it's my task here to bring together all the different ideas that we've heard today, draw some conclusions, etc., summarize everything. Good luck with that. So the papers and presentations have highlighted what I think is a number of important lessons from Europe and Latin American experiences with populism that we can better use to understand the implications of the Trump presidency. And the first of these lessons, in the most general sense, is that the institutional environment in which populists maneuver is very important. Okay. Now, we still need to better understand exactly how it matters. What is the impact of presidentialism versus parliamentarism in terms of how populists interact with the various institutional rules that they face. Nevertheless, a few important ideas I think have surfaced here. And one important difference that I think we have to remember when we're examining populists that have emerged in Latin America or populists that have emerged in Eastern, Central Europe is that they emerged in an environment in which traditional parties were discredited and existing institutions were weak and malleable. Okay. Indeed, in fact, these populists came to power in large part because the traditional parties were weak, were discredited, because the existing institutions were fairly new or if not new, at least reasonably weak. And once they took power, of course, they reformed the existing constitutions, they overhauled existing institutions in a way that strengthened their hold on power, weakened the traditional parties, undermined horizontal accountability. Okay. Now, Trump is coming to power in a whole different context. The U.S., as we've talked about, has a well-established system of checks and balances that significantly constrains presidents, including, of course, an independent legislature, independent judiciary, and President Trump has already seen various initiatives blocked by Congress and the judiciary. Trump can try to do what the Latin Americanists did by essentially trying to reform the constitutions, but that's extremely difficult in the U.S. context. I mean, as Cristobal pointed out, Trump can't simply convoke constitutional assemblies in the way that the Latin American populace has done. It's also really important, as a number of the paper and panelists brought out, is that the political opposition in the United States is much stronger and Trump is much weaker than their counterparts in Latin America or Hungary. The Democratic Party has won the popular vote in 6 out of the last 7 presidential elections. It controls a large portion, albeit a minority, but a large portion of both chambers of Congress, along with various governorships, state legislatures, etc. In addition, the media, which of course has been quite critical of Trump, is much more developed and independent in the United States than in Latin America or Eastern Central Europe, as is the non-governmental sector. Trump, meanwhile, of course, has relatively low public approval ratings, poor relations with much of the Republican Party establishment, and so he's not nearly in as strong a position as the Latin American and some of the Central and Eastern European populists have been. Moreover, Trump's control of his own party is questionable. Okay. And this contrasts quite significantly with the Latin American and East Central European experience. Now, several of the participants have observed that Trump's relationship with his own party may prove to be key. Okay. Many populist leaders outside of the U.S. have not sprung from strong established parties, but have rather created their own parties. Okay. However, this is really a double-edged sword because, as some of the participants have pointed out, in the long run, it helps populists to have a very strong party behind them. So the Latin Americanists, of course, they created their own parties, which means they could control them, but at the same time, these parties were not strong. So to the extent, if Trump is able to gain control of a strong party in the way that Orbán, for example, has done, this would prove extremely pernicious for democracy. All right, but at the present time, Trump is not in control of the Republican Party. Of course, he retains some high levels of popularity among the Republican electorate, as well as numerous resources that come with the office of the presidency. And he can put pressure on Republicans to support his initiatives. But as Roberts points out, the outcome may well be determined by whether a few key members of the Republican Party decide it is in their interest to challenge them, which so far they have done on a few occasions, okay? And they will continue to have incentives to do so as long as, particularly the ones, as I've pointed out, that come from battleground states where it's not just the Republican primary that they care about, but also the general election. Okay? Now, what could change this situation is some sort of crisis situation that we've talked about that could boost Trump's popularity considerably and make Republicans and Democrats alike less willing to challenge him. A major terrorist attack, people have pointed out, or a serious foreign conflict could potentially provide Trump with a boost necessary for him to assert greater constitutional powers to begin to dismantle democratic institutions. Okay. How likely is this to happen? I think I'm fairly skeptical. I'm particularly skeptical that some sort of economic crisis could help him because, of course, the big difference between Trump and Latin American populists, for example, is that he doesn't come to power in a situation of economic crisis. So any economic crisis that would occur now would undermine him. Yes, a foreign conflict or a terrorist attack could potentially empower him, but I think many Americans today might actually, certainly in terms of a foreign conflict, they might blame him for that. Certainly if we went to war in North Korea today, I don't think that would strengthen Trump. I think it would actually weaken him because I think a lot of people would think we have no business, that there's a certain conflict fatigue today among the American public because of our involvement in previous wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, etc. All in all, I, like a lot of the panelists here, am less worried about a full-fledged assault by Trump on democratic institutions than I am about a steady deterioration of democratic norms. Certainly, the way in which Trump has attacked the media, attacked the judiciary, attacked the political opposition, has been much harsher and more consistent than any recent president. Okay? And this is not good for democracy. Trump has also exacerbated ethnic tensions, like ethnopopulists in Europe, like the radical right in Europe. He's used all of this very anti-immigrant rhetoric, denouncing Mexican immigrants as criminals, denouncing Muslims as terrorists. And this is a concern. We do need to be worried about the unraveling of interethnic relations in this country. We're relatively fortunate in this country. We have not in the past had ethnic parties. The ethnic conflict literature and ethnic parties literature is pretty clear about how you can have this process of outbidding in which different leaders of ethnic groups denounce members and exacerbate ethnic fears in a way that contributes to ethnic polarization and the breakdown of ethnic relations to society. So this is something that could happen in the United States, just as it's happened in other countries. I think we also need to be really concerned about the extent to which Trump has violated presidential traditions of releasing tax returns, avoiding financial conflicts of interest, how he's tried to block investigations of his staff and himself, firing the director of the FBI, criticizing his own attorney general for recusing himself from the investigation, and how he has questioned the integrity of the electoral process. And although prominent Republicans and Democrats have criticized these violations and some of his actions, they've really been powerless to stop him. So, for example, as Kevin Deegan-Krause has pointed out, the U.S. Constitution really provides very few mechanisms to control presidential behavior, short of an outright impeaching the president, which is extremely difficult to do.
But we should do more often.
Which we should do. So this is really a very, I think Trump really has exposed the degree to which we rely on these unwritten norms. These aren't constitutional norms, as Steve talked about. These aren't constitutional rules. These are norms of behavior. And Trump has taken advantage of this fact, and this is problematic. So that, although all of these actions, it may be perfectly constitutionally permissible for Trump to denounce various institutions, for him to question the integrity of the electoral process, for him to make, ethnically insensitive remarks at best. All of this may be perfectly constitutional, but it nevertheless undermines, I think, our democratic process. And so, moreover, as the Zavlov and Verbik paper points out, populists may influence the behavior of non-populists, so that as future, in terms of both future presidents and political leaders, they may also feel emboldened to make the same type of remarks or the same type of attacks that Trump has done. Now, it's also possible, however, as Kurt alluded to, that Trump's violations of democratic norms could have the opposite effect. It could lead to a democratic backlash, similar to what this country experienced to a degree after Nixon. It could lead some of these unwritten norms to be incorporated into our laws or rules in terms of, the relationship between the FBI, for example, and the president, or the relationship between the Attorney General and the president. Certainly, we could take steps to make these institutions more independent from the president. So that brings me to the question of how should the opposition respond to these violations. As Cristobal talks about in his paper, an anything goes strategy was very counterproductive in Latin America. And it could backfire in the United States as well. So if opposition groups respond to Trump's violations of democratic norms by participating in violent protests, for example, they may end up bolstering Trump's popularity. They may give him an excuse to implement authoritarian measures. Moreover, violations of democratic norms by the opposition also weaken our democratic norms. It doesn't matter whether it's the opposition doing it or the ruling party doing it. This is not good for democracy. And the fact is, even nonviolent mass mobilizations may be counterproductive. So one thing that we've seen in Latin America is this cycle of mobilizations and counter-mobilizations that I'm not convinced helps anybody, helps either side, and certainly doesn't help democracy. It just leads to increased polarization. The best bet of the opposition, I would argue, may be a combination of electoral and institutional opposition, strategies that did pay off at times in Latin America. And in fact, the Latin American opposition has at times been able to defeat populist leaders in elections, even though the playing field was tilted against them. Okay? So this is not a this is a strategy that I think has paid off, even in a context that is much worse than what we're facing in the United States at this time. All right. Roberts presented 3 potential outcomes for a Trump presidency. I would like to add a 4th one, which I would refer to as contagious populism. And this outcome strikes me as more likely. Under this scenario, Trump's perpetual involvement in controversies of his own making, undermines his popularity and makes it difficult for him to enact major policy initiatives. Under this scenario, he continues to violate democratic norms, but he does not directly violate constitutional rules or overhaul democratic institutions. However, so Trump to a degree is powerless. However, the violations of democratic norms shape the behavior of future politicians, of future presidents, who feel free to ignore these conflicts of interest, who feel free to harshly criticize whomever they disagree with, and interfere with supposedly or traditionally independent governments and institutions. So democracy under this scenario emerges from the Trump era intact, but nevertheless unscathed. But not unscathed, in a way that has very negative implications for our future. So let me stop there. I'll turn it over to Steve for some final comments.
So Raúl gave me kind of a tough task here. It's never entirely clear exactly what I was supposed to be commenting on. First he said, well, accumulate comments over the course of the conference and build those in, and which is hard because every single comment I wrote down, somebody else said during because it's a group of smart people, mostly just the dread pirate Roberts, Ken Roberts said took most of my points away, and then he said, okay, well, respond to me, but I never find anything to disagree with Raúl, so I don't have much. Couple points though. Couple of points where I think we're engaging in a little wishful thinking, Mr. Madrid. Foreign crises. People are going to blame Trump. I cannot think of a precedent in American history where we're in a major security crisis and citizens are fearful and they blame the president and they don't rally behind it. I think there's zero, to my knowledge, evidence for that. The other one, which I think is wishful thinking, is this Democratic backlash. That would be great. That's happening among our friends. I think the polarized nature of the media sphere and parties today is such that we're in a very, very different world from post-Nixon. All right. So what else do I have to say? Not too much. I wanted to build on a couple of points though that mostly agreeing with Raúl, and one of them has to do with norm erosion. So we've this is mostly my fault, talked throughout the term democratic norms constantly in this conference. There are a lot of different kinds of norms. There are a lot of different kinds of ways that leaders can violate norms. Not all norm violations are bad. Many of them are harmless. Some of them are good. So Teddy Roosevelt refused, there used to be a tradition there still is a tradition of having a White House Christmas tree. Teddy Roosevelt was an environmentalist. They used to cut down fresh Christmas trees. He refused to do it. He broke the norm of having a fresh Christmas tree. All right. Jimmy Carter broke the norm. I think he was the first president who got out of his limousine during the inaugural parade. It was a little populist to sort of be with the people, and that established that was a norm violator at the time. I think it was Harrison was the first guy who broke the norm. Used to be that presidential candidates can't actually campaign for the presidency. You had to have this sort of Cincinnatus-like image that you don't actually want the presidency, and actually actively seeking votes was against the norms. And so William Henry Harrison was the first guy to actually go out and campaign for votes, and that was probably a democratic thing. It's a good thing. So what is it with Trump's norms? Clearly some norms or some norm violations are harmful for democracy. And back in the early 90s, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote a piece that was very unpopular with progressives about defining deviancy down. He was mostly talking about things like out-of-wedlock pregnancies in inner cities. But the idea was that certain violations or certain deviancies were becoming so widespread that society lost its capacity to be appalled by it and essentially had to, by default, accept it. And I think that is potentially what is happening with political deviancy today. And Raúl is absolutely right that the Republicans, although they may be able to constrain Trump in certain areas, have absolutely no response, no ability to respond to his political deviancy. And they are forced to get up the next day, no matter what the hell he tweets, and no matter what Paul Ryan says, or no matter how many tables you crawl under the day of the event, you got to get up the next day and be his partisan ally. And they all do. And they all, with the exception of Susan Collins, all of them vote with Trump in excess of 80% of the time. So Republicans are clearly, effectively, they have no alternative but to tolerate and condone this behavior. So they are defining political deviancy down. And in so doing, I think what they are doing is expanding the realm of acceptable political behavior, which I think can have direct negative consequences for democracy. Let me just quickly point to 4 areas where I think the implications for democracy are pretty direct. One is rejecting the legitimacy of elections. It's been a very long time, I think since the post-Civil War, that anybody has questioned, any major candidate has questioned the legitimacy of elections in the United States. That's having real consequences. Now, polls show that a very large percentage of Republican voters doubt that we have free elections in this country, believe that elections are fraudulent. And there's one poll, I'm not sure how much credibility to put in it, but there's one poll that shows that if Trump were to propose postponing the elections because we haven't sorted out whether the voter rolls are okay, that they would support that. So when you begin to undermine the electorate's faith in elections, that's highly consequential. The other one is lying, right? Outright lying, not trying to cover it, just bald outright lying, almost completely unprecedented. Can have a huge effect in terms of undermining voters' faith in their elected leaders. I have not fully thought out the long-term consequences of this, but I think they're terrible. Attacking the media. Polls now show that a very large percentage of Republicans will support punishing, even closing down media outlets that are deemed to have published inaccuracies. It's pretty dangerous. And maybe most importantly, or most egregiously, physical violence. A couple of people mentioned or put up slides of some of Trump's quotes condoning physical violence. We had a Montana congressional candidate body slam a reporter for asking about health care and winning election the next a few days later. So these are areas where clear, and a lot of this began before Trump. It's not all attributable to Trump, but it's clearly accelerated this process of expanding the realm of what is acceptable political behavior in this country, and I find it very worrisome. I also wanted to pick up on Raúl's point about opposition strategy. The debate has kind of been framed as sort of protest versus institutional strategies, and I think that's not quite right. I think there are different kinds of institutional strategies and different kinds of protest strategies, and that probably matters. There are institutional strategies that defend existing norms and institutions, and there are institutional strategies that don't. There was a lot of discussion, there continues to be a lot of discussion among Democrats, among progressives, that Democrats, that the lesson of this election, or the lesson of the theft of the Merrick Garland Supreme Court seat, the lesson of that is that Democrats need to learn to fight like Republicans, right? If we don't fight like Republicans, we're going to play the sucker. It's like going into a boxing match with a hand tied. You play by the norms while the other side is constantly violating the norms, and you're going to get sucker punched. I think that could backfire in two important ways. One of them was pointed out by Kurt, the other one was pointed out by Raúl. First of all, there's pretty good evidence that would likely allow, it would polarize, it would induce the governing coalition to close ranks and probably justify further authoritarian measures. I think it's a very high-risk strategy to sort of engage in this tit-for-tat confrontation with a potentially authoritarian government. So the risk of polarization, and Venezuela 2002 is a great example. Very, very different case. Not saying that would happen in the United States, but there's a very, very high risk of unifying the governing coalition and pushing the government into more authoritarian measures. The other one, though, I think even more important, and this was mentioned by Raúl, is that Democrats fighting like Republicans would reinforce and accelerate the process of norm erosion that U.S. democracy is currently suffering, which I think could be threatening. I think if we were to remove, I'm not opposed to impeachment if the bar for impeachment remains high, and if it's a largely bipartisan process. If it were a Fernando Lugo-style impeachment, if Democrats were to win in 2018 and vote, or even a Clinton-style impeachment, remove Trump or attempt to remove or weaken Trump via constitutional hardball, they would contribute to a further erosion of our democratic guardrails, and eventually it would be a Pyrrhic victory because they would inherit a democracy in which hardball tactics were increasingly widespread and accepted and legitimate. And President Booker or President Sanders or President Warren would likely be the next victim of that. So I'm skeptical of that. In terms of protests, I think there's evidence that different kinds of protests have different kinds of effects. There's pretty good evidence that violent protest is often counterproductive, including in the United States. I think of recent work by Omar Wasow at Princeton. But also pretty good evidence that muscular protest that is norm defending, that is rights defending, that is institution defending, is less counterproductive. And I think Dan Brinks made an excellent, important point, one that I had not thought of in the morning, which is that the Democrats, if they're going to pursue an electoral strategy effectively, they need to mobilize voters who don't vote enough. Young people, minorities, voters, and lower income people. And just saying, leave this to us, well, Chuck and Nancy will negotiate this, we've got an institutional solution, is probably not the best way to do that. And so an element of mobilization may be critical to an electoral strategy. I'll stop there. We have time to.
So we have some time for questions and comments. We'll kind of alternate between questions from here from the room, and then we'll also address some of the questions that were submitted from the web. Nobody wants to go right now. We'll get a couple of people from the...
So we've been discussing the whole day the consequences of Trump in the US and how other countries could be used to think about Trump here. And as a Brazilian who is seeing democracy being undermined in my country, I am quite worried about the opposite effect. And so I would like to ask, making use of professors who have been thinking about international effects in domestic policies, even if he does not succeed as a populist leader by an optimistic or a pessimistic position, whatever success can be, what kind of effect would he have internationally in terms of affecting democracy elsewhere? And if we are having a conference 4 years from now, what would these effects in Europe and Latin America be? And if we would change the name of the conference in that sense. Thank you.
It went away. So we have a question that was submitted on the web from Arturo Lopez Levy. Is the distinction between inclusionary versus exclusionary populism relevant in the comparison between Trump and the Latin American cases? Questions from the audience? Comments? We can have more people from the web. Paloma, do you have anybody else who submitted a question?
No, but I have a crazy one. How many steps away are we from becoming a banana republic?
You put me in a place where I'm going to be the one closest to agreeing with the premise of your question. I don't want to be there.
Loaded.
Because in terms of the effects of Trump on Europe, what I think was interesting is that several, I think, European politicians saw that even the populists in Europe, when they were compared to Trump, that actually made them less popular, right? So to a certain extent, it reinforced these norms of like, oh well, we don't want to be that crazy. So I'm not sure that the effect is going to be very obvious to check. I think it's going to depend on place to place.
Ken.
Could I just follow up on the question about the Banana Republic? Let's put it maybe in a different way. What would be the steps that you would most worry about? So if you saw them, what would be the things that would be most concerning? There's a group I'm aware of that's sort of pre-planning demonstrations in case Mueller is fired, so that they're ready to go when that happens. And I'm wondering what other kinds of triggers would be something that you would really look out for.
Ken wanted to.
Oh, sorry.
Just with respect to the different kinds of opposition strategies and what their effects might be, often unintended. I think it's important that we think in dialectical terms in terms of what the responses would be. It seems to me that, given the arguments that I and others have made today about the centrality of the relationship between Trump and the Republican Party, and whether or not the Republican Party really, at least elements of the Republican Party, become defenders of the regime and democratic norms, or whether they bandwagon behind some sort of populist, potentially authoritarian project. It seems to me that it's absolutely critical for the opposition to think strategically in terms of, what can we do that will not unify the Republican Party behind Trump, but in fact may drive a wedge within the Republican Party and separate what are at least potentially democratic components that are there from those that are part of this authoritarian, this populist bandwagoning. And it seems to me that I think some sort of violent social protest, I think, is highly likely to unify the Republican Party behind Trump and support some sort of rally behind the flag phenomenon, at least on that side. Are there forms of norm defending and norm supporting social protests? I think is much more likely to drive a wedge between sectors within the Republican Party and potentially to undermine his support within the party. And ultimately, I think it's very, like you said before, the possibility that would then dovetail into broader forms of electoral mobilization, I think, are much more likely. But I would argue as well, I think, strictly an electoral and institutional model of resistance, I fear is likely, not to have the kind of leverage that may be necessary.
Want to do a first round of responses?
Sounds good. So let me respond first to Steve's comment that, it's wishful thinking, that a foreign conflict will, lead people to rally around Trump. Well, I think, first of all, I would separate between a short-term and a long-term effect. I think in the short term, you might be right, that there would be a rally around the flag effect. In the long term, I'm not so sure. Second, I would point out that, the context is pretty different now than it's been in the past. So we are we're still in Afghanistan. We still are in a foreign conflict. We just recently got out of Iraq. I think there is much more conflict fatigue now than there's typically been in the past. So for example, after just getting out of the Vietnam War, if we'd immediately plunged into another foreign conflict, would there have been a rally around the flag effect? I'm not quite sure. There would have been. And so I'm not quite sure there would be now either. Now, of course, it always depends on what foreign conflict we intervene in. And I would have to say, the North Korean conflict seems the one that it would be least propitious for a rally round the flag effect. I think most people tend to agree with, Steve Bannon of all people, that North Korea is the last place that we actually want to intervene in a muscular military way. So it's hard for me to imagine where Trump would intervene militarily that you would generate this huge groundswell of support for him. Maybe there's a place, I don't know, but it's hard for me to imagine. I do agree with you in terms of a terrorist attack. That is, I think a terrorist attack at this point would only strengthen Trump. Let me also briefly respond to the issue of democratic backlash. And let me be clear, I don't think there's going to be any democratic backlash as long as Trump is still president, okay? So any democratic backlash that might come in a positive, effective way, I think would have to come after Trump leaves office. And there I could see, assuming that the Democrats do come to power after Trump, that there would be serious effort, that Trump would have exposed some weaknesses within our system that we might want to resolve in the same way that, after Nixon, there were all these hearings about, these things that the CIA was doing, et cetera, that led to some reforms. And so I could see that happening post-Trump, but of course that would be dependent on the Democrats actually winning the election, which of course is an open question at this point. A few other questions. What effect will Trump have internationally? And some people identified, well, in fact, Trump doesn't play very well internationally. And so he may have had a positive effect on European elections and hurt populists there. In the same way that it is arguable that Chávez had a negative impact on some Latin American elections, like in Peru, for example, that hurt Humala the first time Humala ran for president. But overall, it's hard for me to argue that Trump is going to have a positive impact internationally. Certainly the Trump administration is abandoning the democracy promotion and support for democracy worldwide. And I do think that will have a very, potentially quite negative impact on democracy worldwide. Trying to read my own handwriting. Is the is the distinction between inclusive and exclusionary populism relevant? Well, I think it is. I've argued it is in various conflicts. So in Latin America, in ethnic terms at least, populism has tended to be pretty inclusive. So Evo Morales's whole, the way he has come to power was in part by not just reaching out to indigenous people and mobilizing indigenous people, but also reaching out to mestizos, to whites in Bolivia, and to practicing very inclusive discourse. Now, some of this, the fact that populism in Latin America has been ethnically inclusive is partly a product of the fact that Latin American countries haven't experienced large levels of immigration, okay? And so there isn't this this sort of subordinate ethnic other that is an immigrant that is not part of the sort of national community for the populists to mobilize against. In fact, I think just the opposite has populists in Latin America have sought to reach out to a variety of different ethnic groups, whether they've done so explicitly or implicitly. And so Trump, in that sense, resembles the European populace much more than he does the Latin American populace. And I think that's quite problematic for interethnic relations in the United States. I don't think we can assume that interethnic relations aren't going to be negatively affected by populism. And I would argue in in Latin America, interethnic relations have not deteriorated as a result of populism, whereas in Europe, I think they have, and in the United States, they certainly could. How many steps away from being a banana republic are we? I think we're pretty far away still, and that's for some of the reasons I talked about, our institutions, et cetera. But maybe another reason is that the U.S. can't be invaded by the U.S. by definition. And so for that reason alone, I don't think we're a banana republic. And what would be the steps I would most worry about? Well, certainly I would worry about firing Mueller. I do really worry about ethno-nationalism and how we could have this process of ethnic outbidding take place in the United States. The more people are convinced that Trump is on, the more white supremacist groups, et cetera, white nationalists are convinced that Trump's on their side and they want to mobilize and use that type of rhetoric. And the more, Latinos, African Americans are convinced that Trump, is against them, is a racist, et cetera, I think that could lead to this spiral that we have seen in other countries that has quite negative effects. Finally, what can we do to drive a wedge within the Republican Party? I think that's a really good question. I wish I knew the answer, and I wish the Democrats knew the answer to that, but I think it's certainly something we can talk about. Maybe Steve has the answer to that.
I'd have a much better job than I have. I'm not going to go back to the wishful thinking thing, but good. I finally found a place where I disagree with you, Raúl. I agree with. I pass quickly through this because I agree entirely with Raúl's response to the Trump effect on democracy. I do not think we'll see much diffusion of Trumpism as a model, although Bolsonaro is making an effort at that in Brazil. But I'm not quite as worried about that. But for sure, I mean, this is clearly the least democracy-promoting U.S. administration we've had since Nixon, maybe Reagan's first term, but this is an abandonment of basically half a century of democracy promotion that is likely to have, at least at the margins, a negative effect. And also, and this is a decline that began before Trump, but is accelerating. The U.S. democracy as a model is just, not only is out the window, it's in the toilet. I mean, the idea that we have any authority in promoting liberal democracy based on the U.S. model, when our president calls the electoral system fraudulent and threatens to lock up his rival and attacks the media, that's very, very difficult at this point. A little bit more indirectly, it's possible that Trump will fuel populism in the sense, particularly in Latin America, because Latin American governments, as much as they despise Trump, they have to work with the U.S. government. Even the Mexican government, the Peña Nieto has to work with Trump. They have to take certain actions to maintain a decent relationship with the U.S. government, which I think is going to make them vulnerable to getting called out by populist political entrepreneurs. So in that sense, it could fuel populism. I like Raúl's answer to the distinction between exclusionary and inclusionary populism. I think it's right on. Banana republic. I mean, I don't think we're close to being a banana republic, but more concretely, we are seeing, and this gets back to the point I made early in the morning, a politicization of institutions, the abandonment of forbearance and the use of formerly neutral institutions as political weapons. And that is something you see much more widespread in Latin America. Historically, some cases more than others, not so much Chile, much more Argentina and Peru. But the kind of behavior that we saw, whether it's the Texas redistricting or the Clinton impeachment, or to me, most strikingly, the denial of Obama's right to try to fill a Supreme Court vacancy, that kind of constitutional hardball is widespread among many Latin American democracies. And in that way, you see a certain Latin Americanization as our democratic norms of forbearance erode. What steps do I worry about? I worry a lot about anti-fraud initiatives and voter and vote restrictions. That is an area where there is no wedge between the Republicans and Trump. That's an area where there's a fusion of interests between Trump and the Republican Party. It's an area, these are state-level reforms. The Republicans are dominant across the states. I think we have no idea where this Kobach Commission is going to go, but I would be worried if we see a repeal of the motor voter law, and particularly if we see momentum on the anti-fraud front. That would worry me. I don't expect a dramatic collapse of our democratic institutions, as several people, including Ken, put it. The worst case scenario is probably a gradual and relatively marginal slide into competitive authoritarianism, or whatever you want to call it, a skewing of the playing field. And I think one of the most vulnerable areas is voting rights. It's been done before in the United States. And I would worry a lot about violence and an increasing sort of law and order rhetoric around violence. And this is something, I don't know if any of you saw or have seen some of the NRA's recruiting videos recently. They're pretty frightening. And an increase in that sort of rhetoric would worry me a lot. A third thing, which I think is a little bit more far out, but which other people worry about, is the possibility of constitutional reform. Not a Bolivarian-style constitutional reform, but Governor Abbott-style constitutional reform. The Republicans are, in terms of their control of state houses and state legislatures, pretty close to being in a position to, and they're talking about things like balanced budget amendments. They're not talking about unlimited re-election, but that would worry me at this point. Yeah.
So you see, long day of debate about Trump and erosion of democratic norms and all these kinds of things that comes to a conclusion. In some sense, it hurts me as a foreigner to let you go on such a pessimistic note. So I don't want to go back to the democratic backlash. But I mean, in my view, I think what will be really important is the 2018 midterm elections. Because if the Republicans see the ship is going down because Trump isn't addressing the cultural crisis and the economic crisis that his supporters see, because how would he actually address it, right? If his support goes down, I can see them jumping ship very quickly, and it wouldn't only be from the Democratic side, but they might say, this toxic type of populism doesn't work. So if I can just, as a foreigner, conclude with a little bit of optimism at the end, and thank everybody for being with us for this long day of debates and discussions, and it's really great to have such an audience at 5:30 on a Friday afternoon. So thank you very much.